it going.
I mean, this is just a really wonderful example of the importance of history and the use of history to better understand what's happening in a field site. So for folks who do, I feel like qualitative methods, especially, like it's interesting to understand, but typically history doesn't get deployed in the same way in a mixed method study. I feel like history often drops out. I mean, I think when we say mixed methods, we often think, add some interviews and stir or something like that, but like the role and impact of history, right, like drops out of the story, and history becomes so important because without innovation you don't get investment. Without investment you don't get this economic and political elite that take hold in a town, as you say, control the social order in very interesting ways, or engineer and maintain the social order in interesting ways, which leads to another pillar, which we should probably get to later, but I want to get to now, which is corruption. And the reason why I want to talk about corruption is well, because it's central to your argument about what's producing the kinds of poverty that you see. But also the way you think about corruption is very different. Corruption, exploitation, perhaps, is very different from the way that I think Matthew Desmond thinks about, not quite corruption, but certainly exploitation. So like Matthew Desmond, exploitation of the poor through federal policy. But for you, there are these individual histories. And I'm thinking about his the latest book, Poverty by America, whatever. But for you, it is the political history of the place and the political relations that take hold, that breed a kind of corruption. Can we talk about corruption in these places for a bit?
Yeah, so let me start with the present day, and then I'm going to bring history into it, because, if there's one thing that I came to from this is that you really do have to understand history to understand, why things are the way they are. And so, it's like that goes in the category of things I would have said I understood as a scholar until I did this project. And then I was like, oh, like I didn't understand it. I did exactly what you said, is like, oh, history is important, and not let me like pretend like, all these problems just appeared out of nowhere. So, every single community that we were in had a fairly recent example of local government corruption. And the most famous one, the one probably a lot of folks have heard about, is the Mississippi welfare scandal. So, just tracking back to my first book, it was about, when we reformed welfare, we thought we were making a work first, time limited welfare program in TANF. But actually, we converted welfare into a very flexible funding stream for states, that they can provide cash assistance to families, or they can really do whatever else they want about the money, as long as they can figure out a few sentences to justify that it, promotes marriage, reduces out-of-marriage births, helps families in their homes. And so states all across the country have taken advantage of this. And, Michigan's an example where now we only spend 6% of our TANF dollars on actual cash assistance for families. Like the vast majority goes to all sorts of other stuff that the state was probably going to pay for anyways. So in essence, it's unrestricted cash. Mississippi, has this case where folks took it, that's pretty much over the line by my standpoint, but like they took it all the way over the line. So there was a nonprofit in Greenview, Mississippi that, Greenwood, of course, that, contracted with the state and was leagued with the state, and they absconded with, according to the state auditor, like $80 million in TANF funds at the same time when they're denying every family. They had like a 97% rejection rate for their TANF program. So they're denying everybody. There's a lot of poor families in Mississippi. So the money was going to schools that, as far as we can tell, weren't actually serving anybody. And they were very famously going to celebrities. So Brett Favre received $1.1 million for speeches that nobody can prove that he actually gave. The state made a $5 million contribution to a volleyball court at Southern Mississippi, right at the same time that Brett Favre's daughter happened to be playing volleyball there. And, as far as we can tell, there's like one event for like underserved kids that was hosted at that facility, after the fact. Some pro wrestlers got money. One dude was paid to provide sort of speeches about staying off drugs. He himself got addicted, and so the TANF dollars paid for him to go to like a very high-end rehab place in California, right? So just like the stories go on and on about and the people who started it, at least the nonprofit leaders, are now in prison. All figured out by like all broken by local journalism. Mississippi Today, Anna Wolf, she just won the Pulitzer Prize, just really incredible work. So that was the most high profile one, but we've got, all sorts of examples. Down in Crystal City in like 2016, the FBI descends onto City Hall. And during that period, every member of the city council plus the mayor, they all get arrested. And maybe even more problematic for the community, like all the public records are taken by the FBI for the investigation. So the next dude who comes in to try to run the town like has no record of anything that's been happening in the town. So this is like for racketeering. It's for in another town close by, there's sort of an illegal gambling operation that's going on. There's a factory that gets a big subsidy to come to Marion County in South Carolina, and the factory never appears. No jobs ever appeared, but they get the money. And then you get to Clay County, and there's just like the stories are incredible of folks who are running Manchester, Kentucky, who are in league with drug dealers, are getting payoffs for contracts with the city. A set of reformers decide to take them on, and they end up actually winning control of the city government, but then they themselves actually end up being prosecuted because they were engaging in vote buying in order to win. And the people who testified against them were, the old folks. They're folks who were buying votes at the same time, which of course is all illegal. So we can understand this as like a problem that communities are facing today. And if you look at corruption in that way, I think you've got a couple of choices. One is, community leaders that should be spending time figuring out how to bring jobs to communities, how to make schools better, are spending most of their time, enriching themselves. And all the way to the Mississippi example, where like money is being taken out of the pockets of low-income Mississippi families. I think some people can take corruption in a community as a sign that they sort of deserve to be poor, right? And so it can be done in a victim blaming way. I think that sort of logic almost never understands that there really is a divide between haves and have-nots in all of these communities. I sort of thought they were going to be uniformly poor when I showed up, but some of these places have some of the largest Gini coefficients in the nation, and so there is this divide between the haves and the have-nots. And where history comes in is that like we can go back 100 years, and that's part of what the book does, especially in Appalachia, right? We can go back 100 years and see the exact same kind of like government corruption and the exact same kind of concerns. So there's like this history, right? And then there's a history of using government to perpetuate the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Like I think the story is most familiar in the Cotton Belt, first through slavery and then through Jim Crow, but it gets perpetuated in South Texas too. Actually, some of the plantation owners in the Cotton Belt, as cotton is sort of using up the soil, they actually go to South Texas and they create a whole new system that sort of perpetuates a low-wage labor force and protects the interests of the folks who are running the town. And so there's this like long-term history of corruption that has been used to basically reinforce the order that is in the towns. And sometimes the have-nots actually take over in these places. And when have-nots sort of have there's a revolt and they take over, there's very little to help them figure out how to run the town. And the only model that they've had a lot of the times, the story we tell of this is the rise of La Raza Unitas, which is a political party out of Texas. It actually starts in Crystal City. They take over and they end up sort of replicating some of the same patterns that when the Anglos were running the town, that they were doing. And they sometimes get called out on this, and they say, well, we're just doing exactly what the last folks were doing. So, not only is there any resources if you're running a small town, not only is like every other level of government often rooting against you. When La Raza takes over Crystal City, the governor of Texas famously calls them Little Cuba, and like says he's going to block any federal funding that comes in. But the only model that's available is one of corrupt governance.
One of the ironies as I'm listening to this is how familiar some aspects of your story are to what you'd see in like an American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal from 80 years ago, and how this feudal structure, and in some ways what was very liberating to African Americans in the post-World War II era was actually to migrate to the North and become part of the neoliberal capitalist economy, where you could at least get your marginal product for working in the steel plant. And it is striking when when we read these historical works, we tend to think, wow, this is past. And you're telling a story that would have been quite familiar to to Gunnar Myrdal and his team in 1942. Yep. And ironically, the other thing that's ironic about this is that the people running these places in this feudal way, it's not as if, it's true in one sense there's exploitation, but in another sense, this is just an incredibly inefficient and backward economic model that doesn't generate very much wealth.
Right.
The haves in these places don't have a whole lot. It's not exactly like they're running Google in South Texas, and able to do that. It's a very pathological political economy from just about any perspective. So anyway, that sounded way more great before I said it than after I said it, but I was struck listening to that in that way.
Great to see you, Harold.
Yeah, great to see you too.
The problem when you have one industry that's dominating everything, right? And for that period of time, that one industry is it's too good to pass up, right? For the elites, obviously, is that eventually it crashes, and communities are really devastated from that. And we see that in every place. And in Appalachia, like the enforcement of the social order was not nearly as violent. But the coal companies owned everything, right? They owned people's houses, they owned the bowling alley, they owned the restaurants. And so when they pull out, like everything is devastated. And actually we, make an argument that it's in the wake of that sort of that decline of coal over time, and the rise of like a lot of people who have a lot of pain, more disability, that sort of allows Eastern Kentucky to become the epicenter of the opioid crisis, that those communities were actually targeted for this. And so we can think of opioids really as like the most recent extractive industry that like really is just preying on the bodies of lower income Americans in that region.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? There's this people versus place way to think about, what's the unit of assistance we want to provide in dealing with these injustices. And there is a sense, if these places are so beleaguered by the history and the structural inequalities that are present in these places, is the right policy response to help the most disadvantaged people leave these environments and move? I know, for example, after Katrina, that a lot of the people who left New Orleans and went to Houston the kids did better and they did better. And how do you think about helping that place to heal itself versus helping the people heal themselves by leaving that place?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right that if we're thinking about sending money down to communities, you have to think very clearly about who's going to control the money, who's going to decide how it's going to be used. At the very worst, can it just be absconded with and like the Nancy New Greenwood way? And at the very best, is it just captured by elites and sort of doesn't trickle down? So I think some of the community level ideas that we've offered are much more related to actually like trying to ferret out corruption, trying to help local mayors and city managers of small towns actually do right by communities, right? Providing them with the resources. We come around to like, equal, like trying to have stop having separate and unequal schools as we've had for generations. And one of my favorite parts of the book is this section on segregationist academies and sort of the rise of segregated schools after Brown v. Board. We come to sort of evidence-based policies like paying new teachers more. Like there's actually a lot of evidence that we can help even out the quality of schools a bit by like doing better by folks who are entering the profession. But it's a tough nut to crack. So, maybe a lot of the community level initiatives are much more, so they're focused on different things than we've been focused on. Certainly not just giving money to people running towns, but trying to be a bit more thoughtful on that. And then, there is a lot more to be said about things like the expanded child tax credit, which actually roll out much more evenly across these places.
Thanks a lot. By the way, folks have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to hand things back over to Ruben, but if folks have questions, I see that we can present them to Luke.
Yeah, fantastic. Which this all you started going down this path, but I really wanted to talk for a hot minute about violence. I mean, it's an engine and a byproduct. Like it's in the same way that addiction is, in the same way that you're like refusing to hold individuals responsible for solely responsible. I mean, people have agency, of course, and there's actions, but you're refusing to hold individuals solely responsible. I mean, we look at like epidemics of violence, and this heartbreaking chapter on violence in this book, of course, and so I just wanted you to talk a bit about violence and its role in the production and maintenance of poverty in these deeply disadvantaged places.
Yeah, violence was one of the, there's so many things in this book we didn't expect to write about. Corruption was one. I had no idea we would be writing a chapter on corruption, and violence was another. Social infrastructure, comes out of the conversation about opioids and what our respondents are telling us. But, violence was, I think I shared the preconceived notion that violence was primarily like a problem of urban poverty, like a problem of concentration. And we were struck by how some of our field sites were just incredibly violent. And, the data is hard to, it's hard to find data that's sort of appears to be comparable, but we get some on sort of deaths by interpersonal violence, which is coming from like death certificates, and we think is a little bit more reliable. And you can see in the Delta and in Appalachia sort of rates of violence that really are comparable, in some cases maybe even worse than what we see in our largest cities, where we put more concentration on it. So as you mentioned, there's this like cycle, cycle where violence really negatively impacts communities. You can see it in sort of the well-being of children. I'm sure Harold can talk more about this evidence, but the well-being of children really be negatively impacted by witnessing violent acts, by being part of it. We heard a lot about like the social isolation that violence can cause, where people are scared to go out, right? Or they're scared to get engaged with other people, and so they sort of hunker down. And so that has, negative repercussions for social life across so many dimensions. But again, like, we can understand this as a problem that exists today, or we can go back to history and look at what we would argue is a tradition of violence. So in the Cotton Belt, violence was used. When we think about what did the sort of elite folks who were controlling stuff, white folks, what did they use to sort of perpetuate the social order? And all sorts of state-sponsored violence, lynchings being the most dominant, use of law enforcement, like sort of spreading fear, like basically trying to, especially in places where the white elites are sort of the smallest fraction of the population. You can see, just like this incredibly violent sort of reaction to, I think, the fear of sort of losing control. In Appalachia, there is like this real history of like feuding between families that goes back 150 years too. So the violence looks different, but like it's there and it persists, and like you can see it through these stories of corruption. So there's I think a really incredible body of work that sort of ties things like the number of lynchings in a community to the poverty today, social mobility today. And we make the argument that there is this sort of circular loop where mobility, violence was really used to hinder mobility, right? And hindered mobility itself can spark violence. And I think the patterns persist suggest that we have to like look deeper than the here and now to understand what to do about it.
But I added that there's a lot of intersectional issues that also come up in that environment. Like when I remember Randy Schultz, when he was talking about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, was saying a lot of LGBTQ youth wanted to join the military because they wanted to get out of these places where they were exposed to a lot of violence, whose direction at sexual and gender minorities was worsened by everything that you're just saying, and clearly gender-based violence and other things were also happening. So I think one of the things that our students are much more aware of than I was aware of when I was their age is the intersectional dimension of a lot of the issues that you're talking about here, because definitely are quite prominent.
I love that point for sure. It leads me to a question as we really my last two questions for you, and would love questions from the audience. If you have them, be sure to put them in the Q&A as Harold noted. But my last question is about is about the general framing of like the argument, the problem, which the place you come to, which you came to in the very beginning, but we're here at the end because I feel like a case has been made from this argument about the internal colony, the internal colony. Yeah. Oh, and so I'd love for you to talk a bit about the internal colony, like why that captures what we're talking about here. Places that are violent, that are filled with corruption, that perhaps start off as places of innovation and are ripe for extraction. Like how and why that operates here. And I'd like you to take us home, of course, barring questions from the audience, which of course post there, on thinking about our way out. What are some ways out of this? You began to talk about this with Harold, but let's start with the internal colony, and then let's talk about perhaps ways out.
Yeah, I hope one of our contributions is to try to sort of see the linkages across all of these places. So each are unique. And, I think it's clear that like the violence and sort of egregious injustice of Jim Crow and before slavery is in a class of its own. But there's also this like similar story pattern to each of these places. So, down in South Texas, they're doing whites only primaries. They're doing, then elections when, migratory labor is away. Like they create this migratory labor cycle where folks are doing spinach and onions in South Texas and then going up, I think, to do, different stuff in Minnesota and cherries in Michigan and then coming back. And so all the decisions are getting made when they're not there. Schools are like segregated and deeply unequal, and like that persists well after Brown v. Board. And so many similarities in the patterns across all the places. In Appalachia, like the Supreme Court actually deems Appalachian schools funding unconstitutional, like in the 1980s, because there is such a huge disparity in how much is being spent on kids in Eastern Kentucky versus some of the more affluent parts. So in each place, you have like this one industry that just dominates everything and, has a lot of positive like economic impacts for a small group of people. But it just like crowds everything else out. A very large labor force that is required, and kind of a sub-citizenship, right? A not full citizenship of the great majority of people who are there. And so many of the benefits don't just flow to the local elites, but flow to the nation, right? So it's northern banks that are financing a lot of these operations across every single region. Coal is sort of driving, right, in industry across the nation coming from Eastern Kentucky. We already talked about cotton. People are eating tabletop vegetables from South Texas. All of these things we all benefit from off of the labor of a set of people who don't have full citizenship. And so that's what really led us to sort of this language of internal colonies. It's been used by folks in the UK, sort of looking at their system. And there's a long history of it here in the United States, going back to, we're able to trace it back to Frederick Douglass, who's using language like nation within a nation. So thinking of these places as like, for the benefit of the nation on the backs of low-wage workers who are sort of enforced into that, it makes some interesting comparisons with the world. So we're able to see, there are these correlations between, a history of colonization and government corruption. There are these correlations between, internationally, between history of colonization and violence. And so you can really see some of the same patterns seem to emerge. And I think if we think of it as like a pattern, if we think of it as like something that we do as a people, it can help us better contextualize it, sort of understand what's going on, and come up with some of the ways out. So
let's talk about them. Yeah, let's talk about the ways out.
Yeah, so $2 a day was a lovely book in that the solution was pretty darn simple. Give families and kids a little bit of money. And I like to think with the success of the expanded child tax credit, that has been borne out, right? We saw child poverty plummet. We saw the number of families with bad credit actually fall to an all-time low at the end of 2021. So like a stable source of income for a period of time, like led to all these financial benefits for families. Families said, most families said they could like sustain a $400 expense ever at the end of 2021. The solutions to this book are a lot harder. And, there isn't sort of a single thing that I can say, we should do this and everything will be fixed. One thing is this, like, is thinking about our economy. So, these places all have this single industry, and that actually gets replicated in with manufacturing too. So a lot of manufacturing jobs from the north come to the south, and then really get just decimated in the wake of NAFTA, and then the China boom in manufacturing. And actually, the history of a lot of rural southern communities sort of switching from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, like switching from Democrat leaning to like very nationalistic and like right wing, is there's a new NBER paper that says it's just a lot more sudden than any, I used to think it sort of happened gradually over time based on social issues. And it really looks like the passage of NAFTA was kind of like a betrayal, I think, in a lot of these communities. And they really swung right. And, it explains a lot to me why candidate Trump spent an awful lot of time talking about NAFTA. So what do we do with that? Like, I do think maybe it's time to think a little bit more about what manufacturing we keep here. How do we think about our supply chains? But also like diversification within economies, like not putting all of your eggs into one basket, figuring out how to be more inclusive, right? How do we actually, rather than like fighting to bring that one person to town, like, yeah, are there ways that you can like start from the bottom up on that?
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I must say, when I think about these issues globally, there's a raging debate in my head, because in many ways, a sort of neoliberal global market order has benefited many, many parts of the world, except for working class people in the industrial democracies. They seem to be the major losers, even as we have dramatically reduced infant mortality and horrible outcomes in rural China and Vietnam. And how do we, and it seems to me that, and also we have created, there's been tremendous benefits to the world of this open market, but it has also had these punishing consequences and also brought about political backlash. How do we keep an inclusive global order in a way that also distributes some of that surplus to the people that are bearing tremendous pain because of that system? It seems if I could run back the clock, I would not want to say, let's prevent China from exporting to the United States. That would lead to millions of deaths. We know from infant mortality and lots of things that we wouldn't want to do that. So how do you balance those things?
I don't have the answer to this one. I mean, I don't know if you can figure out. I think what the conclusion I've come to is like the answer, which was like, let's compensate the losers and let's train them to do something else. Like that seems to have failed both on a social level and a political level, and like we're paying the consequences for that. So I don't know if like now, like, as demand becomes more global, if it's possible, like, are there niches that can be carved out that just have more distribution? Or some people's answer is a basic income. I don't know how that goes over in some of these communities, but although the cash transfers seem to work during COVID. So I don't have the answers, but having, I went into this project thinking there are winners and losers, but everyone was better off in general, and we have to compensate the losers. And I think the place where I'm at is like, we did not compensate the losers, and they're really, really angry about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's 3 things we have to do to solve this problem, but nobody knows what those 3 things are.
That's right.
Well, what I will say is that I think this is just a fantastic book. I think we have to think. I think it's pushing us to think about poverty in a way that nothing before it has, at least that I've come across, has really offered us. I think that thinking about innovation and corruption and violence And, and including, you know, health and well-being and these kinds of measures and the indicator of deep disadvantage. I think thinking about the role of history, the how we got here. I mean, one of the things you talk about in the book and in the final chapters, the rooting out of corruption, for example, as an important move. I mean, first we have to identify it, you know, identifying the corruption, understanding the history, and for that reason, everyone should read this doggone book. I mean, like, you know, this is a wonderful book, the Injustice of Place. And I'm grateful that you and your colleagues, you and Kathy and Tim, put your collective brain power together to produce it. And it doesn't leave us in a pit. It helps us out in the end by talking about things like rooting out corruption, thinking about you know, investment in children, you know, these kinds of things. And I just can't recommend the book more highly. So Luke, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's been a wonderful honor to sit with you and think through these things, both over time and also, you know, right now. So thank you.
Yeah, Ruben, thank you so much for making the time to do this and for all of the incredible advice that you gave all along the way. And to Harold for training me along. I saw Julie Henley in the chat too, so that was lovely. You know, all the good things I learned from my SSA mentors.
Well, we take full credit.
I will. Maybe I'll just like end on one sort of maybe slightly happy note, which is in our opioid chapter, you know, we like have this experience of folks sort of saying to us, like, we're asking what they like to see in their communities, and over and over again, people kept on saying there's nothing to do but drugs, and we didn't really take it seriously at first, but then, you know, we started to look into it, and it seemed like there is some scaffolding to it, and all sorts of really interesting research on sort of the decline of civic organizations and communities and the rise of opioid deaths. You know, there's some interesting research with laboratory rats, where if you have a solitary laboratory rat and you give him drugs, he will probably overdose and die. But if he has little rat buddies and fun things to do in his cage, he just ignores the drugs and doesn't die ever. And so that has us, you know, I guess in closing, I'll just like invite folks on the phone to think about, like, here is what seems like too simple of a solution of like, we should be building local movie theaters or like local splash pads, like things that are fun, that bring people together, like get them to get out of their homes, and build these social connections that like, you know, impact our brains. And, you know, that's something that actually there is a longer term historical legacy of, like Carnegie libraries, but we don't do so much. And, you know, I think some people don't take it seriously. So that, you know, it's, as you said, Ruben, it's like an invitation to sort of like turn your focus and like think about things a bit differently. And maybe building splash pads or movie theaters is one way that we can actually help communities confront something like addiction.
Yeah. Well, again, Luke, thanks so much for joining us. You know, excellent work as always. And, you know, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and look forward to the next opportunity.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you for having me, and Keith for setting us up.
Everyone have a blessed day. Bye.
Take care, everyone.